Good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get going. So first of all, just to check, this is the panel and we're going to be discussing synthetic data. So just checking everybody's in the right room. Fantastic. Okay. When we got this shift, we thought 3 days of conferences. Have we got the graveyard shift at this conference? But we are delighted to see such a turnout today. So really, thanks each and every one of you for coming. I think we're going to have a great panel discussion here today on synthetic data. It's a really interesting area, and we've fantastic experts joining us here today. We have a lovely mixture of industry, academics, and regulators. So I think we're going to get a really good discussion going. My name is Aoife Sexton. I'm the Chief Privacy Officer for Truata, and we are a company that designs and brings to market privacy-enhancing technologies. So when we were discussing this conference, we realized that there's probably going to be a mixture in the room of knowledge. There's probably going to be some of you here today that are just curious. What is synthetic data? You might have heard about it before. You might have heard, oh, it's this thing, it's fake data. It's a silver bullet. All my privacy worries go away. I can just use synthetic data. Some of you may have more nuanced view of synthetic data. You may understand that it has certain challenges. It may be difficult to create truly anonymous data from data that you've synthesized from an original set of data. And you may also discover that if you want real utility with your synthetic data, then it's going to be really difficult to get the privacy right. So that privacy utility curve is still something that's challenging when we come to synthetic data. So these are going to be some of the topics that we're going to discuss on today. And our goal is to make sure that by the time everybody leaves today, those of you who are here who are just curious about synthetic data will leave with some knowledge. And those of you who perhaps have a more detailed knowledge of synthetic data will also hopefully take away some learnings from today's session. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we're going to get going. And I've kind of come up with some questions for each of the panelists really to get to their area of expertise. And then we will have some Q&A at the end as well. So on my left here, we have Clara Clark-Novella, and Clara leads the AI compliance group within the ICO's technology department, which provides AI technical and policy expertise to the ICO's stakeholder engagement and supervision activities. In addition, her recent work at the ICO includes leading the Generative AI Call for Evidence series, co-producing guidance on privacy-enhancing technologies and on anonymisation, and leading on the G7 DPA's Emerging Technologies Working Group's case study on synthetic data. And I don't know, any of you who have been looking for information on pets in particular will know that the ICO has been one of the leading regulators in terms of publishing guidance in this space. So we're delighted that Clara is here today. Next to Clara, we have Alexandra Ebert. She's an expert in the area of responsible AI, synthetic data, and privacy. And Alexandra serves as Chief Trust Officer at Mostly AI. As a member of the company's senior leadership team, she is engaged in public policy issues in the emerging field of synthetic data and ethical AI, and is responsible for engaging with the privacy community, with regulators, the media, and customers. Apart from her work at Mostly AI, she serves as the chair of the IEEE Synthetic Data IC Expert Group, and was pleased to be invited to join the group of AI experts for Human Eyes initiative, which aims to make AI more inclusive and accessible to everyone. And before she joined the company, she researched GDPR's impact on the deployment of artificial intelligence in Europe. So Alexandra has a fantastic knowledge and expertise, not only in synthetic data, but with responsible AI as well. Next to Alexandra, we've got Gabe Menard, and Gabe is a senior policy and research analyst at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. He is the OPC policy lead on de-identification, biometrics, and facial recognition, and chairs the Emerging Technologies Working Group of the G7 Privacy and Data Protection Authorities. And before entering the public service, he worked and studied at the University of Toronto, where he conducted research at the intersection of policy, society, and digital technology. And last but not least, we have Yves Alexandre de Montjoy, and he's an associate professor of applied mathematics and computer science at Imperial College London. He is currently a special advisor on AI and data protection to the EC Justice Commissioner Reynard, and a Parliament-appointed expert to the Belgian Data Protection Agency. In 2018 to 2019, he was a special advisor to EC Competition Commissioner Verstegen, co-authoring the Competition Policy for Digital Era report. His research has been published in Science and Nature Communications and has enjoyed wide media coverage, and his work on the shortcomings of anonymisation has appeared in the reports of the World Economic Forum, FTC, European Commission, and OECD. So I think you will agree we have some real experts here today. So, to set the scene, I've asked Alexandra to take us through an understanding of what is synthetic data. What are we talking about when we refer to synthetic data? Is it anonymous? Is it not? And as someone who works in the industry and who works with customers and clients, what are some of the challenges that are there in order to try and use synthetic data in businesses? I've asked Alexandra also to talk a little bit about, is it something that can be useful when we're talking about training models for large language models, and also if she has some use cases that are probably the most prevalent use cases that we can see in use in business today. Asked her to touch upon those as well. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm getting this a little bit closer. Thank you for being here today on the last day of the conference. Really great to see that there's so much interest in the upcoming conversation. So as Alfie said, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is synthetic data actually. Those of you who have encountered the term might know it's not a clearly defined term. The term actually has been around for over a decade. Back then it was more overly simplistic mock data. And even today there are so many different categories of synthetic data that we said it would make sense to talk a little bit about the scope of synthetic data that we are covering. And what we want to focus on today is synthetic data that's created for the purpose of privacy protection. Predominantly AI-generated synthetic data, even though there are other approaches to generating it. What's important with this type of synthetic data is that you don't create it out of thin air. You need to have real, most often privacy-sensitive customer, employee, citizen data for an AI algorithm to learn on and then create new synthetic data out of it. This is important from the concept because when we look at more traditional anonymization approaches, masking, obfuscation, the like, most of them are, to say, destructive in nature and stick to the original data set. So you always have the original data and try to just look at those elements of the data set that you assume make the data set easy to re-identify, not privacy safe, and then get rid of them, mask them, etc. With synthetic data, you don't mingle around on the original data set, but you use AI to automatically learn what are the correlations in this data set, what's the structure, how do my customers, for example, act and behave. And then you use that knowledge in combination with a whole host of privacy mechanisms to create new synthetic data from scratch, where you don't have this, or intend to not have this one-to-one relationship between me, who was a customer in the original data set, and a synthetic version of me, but nonetheless a synthetic data set that from a statistical point of view is representative of your original data. And this is why most organizations that we work with see synthetic data as an anonymization technology. You also mentioned I should touch upon this question of is synthetic data now anonymous or not, and I think this would take a little bit of the debate away that we're going to have. With this type of synthetic data, most commonly the intention is to create anonymous data, but you can't automatically say data is anonymous. There needs to, a lot of considerations need to go into that. When we talk about the value of synthetic data, why do we need that? What are the use cases? What I see from the industry, we work a lot with some of the largest banks, insurance organizations, retail organizations, telecommunication providers, even public sector organizations. Most often it's actually AI training. Why is that? We all know that machine learning requires quite a lot of data and high quality data. And also quite interestingly, you need to have granular data that's structurally identical to your production data to make good use of machine learning in a business context. When organizations who were used to working with more traditional anonymization approaches wanted to do AI, they oftentimes run into this challenge of, okay, for traditional anonymization, I need to know in advance from the 100 columns we possess about our customers, these are the fives that I want to traditionally anonymize, not the way how AI works with this explorative nature. So the benefit that synthetic data can bring in terms of utility is that you get a structurally identical data set where you still have, let's say, the 100 columns that you initially collected, just populated with synthetic information. So AI training, I would say, is the biggest use case. What we also see is digital product development, a lot of startup collaborations or collaborations between large organizations and smaller partners, also very often in the context of AI, a little bit of testing, a little bit of cloud migration, but really I think the very most relevant use case for synthetic data is AI training. The reason organizations turn to this technology is on the one hand privacy protection. Yves Alexandre is going to talk a lot about the challenges of anonymization approaches in general and synthetic data in its role of maybe helping with some of those, maybe not helping with some others of that. So it's privacy protection, it's also utility. You touched about the privacy utility trade-off. Of course, we know that we can never have perfect utility and anonymity. That's not possible. Nonetheless, synthetic data can bring quite a lot to the table when we look into utility and at the same time privacy protection. And for most organizations, it's also the question of speed, because with synthetic data, they can oftentimes establish processes that allow them to access synthetic data much quicker or spread this data source to a much wider audience within their organization to accelerate data-driven innovation. And I'm actually stopping here because we have so many other points, but if there's any urgent question that I forgot, please remind me.
Can I follow up with one? I suppose one of the advantages of being on the third day of the conferences is that if you've sat in on other sessions, you'll be thinking about some of the other things you've heard about. And synthetic data and anonymization has come up on different panels. And one of the questions that was asked was, is synthetic data really useful when it comes to training data, because you still need vast amount of training data for large language models? And is it realistic to think you can synthesize vast amount of data for the purposes of training? So
I would distinguish when we talk about machine learning, AI training, and large language models that there are different types of models. So we as Mostly AI work a lot in structured synthetic data. This means that organizations, for example, interested in training a credit scoring algorithm or a customer churn algorithm or something like that, they find that they can use synthetic data as a replacement for their privacy-sensitive production data. With large language models and the type of data that usually goes in there, or with some of the well-known representatives of large language models, there's a whole host of information that goes in there, and I'm not aware that we currently have technology that would be capable to synthesize this amount of data, the entire World Wide Web or big parts of it. Plus, I would also question the utility of doing that.
okay. So Yves Alexandre, I'm going to turn to you next because you're a very well-known researcher in the area of anonymization, privacy risks, risks of de-identification, re-identification. So would really love to hear your thoughts about it. Very often, synthetic data is suggested as being fully anonymous, and therefore it switches off the GDPR and other privacy controls and other privacy regulations. And I'm interested in your research in just in general in the area of anonymization and risk of re-identification, but obviously particularly in the context of synthetic data.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think that the first thing is, and I think thanks Alexandra for explaining this very clearly. I mean, confusingly, from anonymization perspective, from a technical perspective, synthetic data is actually aggregate data. And what that means is that the original record level data, Alexandra's data, is going into a machine learning model alongside all of our data with the purpose of training a model. The information is aggregated across. My information is going to mix with Alexandra's and everyone's data to create a model that would be representative of the population, the data set you're interested in, et cetera, et cetera. And why this matters is that because in general, aggregate data tends to be less risky from a privacy perspective than record-level data. On average, because the information starts to be mixed, the privacy risk, the risk of re-identification tends to be, in general, lower. However, I think we've long known that often there remain a privacy risk, right? We've seen it. I think it has been exemplified even in aggregate data recently with the re-identification of the US Census, which was one of the reasons they decided to implement differential privacy. So there is always a remaining risk. And so it's really, really important to not assume that synthetic data, because it's not Alexandra or me in the data set, and actually the output often doesn't link to one person, right? It's someone that, it's, if you think about faces, right, it's gonna be, Alexandra's hair and maybe my eyes and something, right? It doesn't link to one person. It doesn't modify one person the way the identification does. It's literally, it draws characteristics and creates a representative sample. And it's really, really important to not assume that because it does this, because it takes characteristics from everyone, mixes them in a bag, and then generates data, that it is necessarily safe from a privacy perspective. And that's why we think that it's really, really crucial anytime you're going to create and release synthetic data to test the robustness, to test the privacy of the data that you're about to release against membership inference attack, attribute inference attack, and a range of other privacy threats, which is a process that is now known as red teaming. And this is true, and this is a bit more controversial, even if you use, formal methods like differential privacy. Why? Because very often in practice, it's really, really hard. It can be really, really hard to maintain, to use it in a way in which the formal guarantees actually give you a robust upper bound on the risk. And for those who are versed in differential privacy, what I'm referring to is the fact that often you have to use, and we've seen it again and again with machine learning models, that you can make models differentially private with a very high epsilon, which basically kind of cancels out a lot of, at least cancels out the formal guarantees. It doesn't mean it doesn't help, but it means that the formal guarantees are not necessarily meaningful. And so it's a fast-moving field in computer science on basically producing methodology, producing tools to test the privacy of synthetic data. So I think my main advice would be, first, I think the reliability of the answers that you get depends on the care and the time you put into testing it. Red teaming is not a checkbox. If you spend an hour to try to do something, you might very well leave open risk that you've just not identified because you did not spend enough time, enough resources, or using state-of-the-art methodology to evaluate the risk. Same thing then in cryptography. We want our results to be future-proof, right? You don't want to be basically testing something and that suddenly tomorrow someone comes up with a slightly better attack, someone changes something, and then suddenly your whole thing falls apart, and suddenly the risk of identification becomes significant. And to do this is basically what it means is that you need to assess the risk against not one attacker that you think, oh, this is what I'm trying to protect against, right? Someone's ID of some person on the internet with access to some resources, et cetera, et cetera. What it really means is that you need to test against a range of attackers, including attackers that you think are too strong, not realistic. You're like, oh, but no one would really have access to this piece of information and this and this. To truly assess the risk, make sure that your results are going to be future-proof, and make sure that you leave a reasonable safety margin. So for instance, like a lot of attacks so far had assumed access to what we call an auxiliary data set. This kind of magical computer science construct of, well, somehow I have access to data that looks like your data but isn't your data that I can use to try to find someone in your data, which is the way you set up attacks. And this has led a range of people to basically dismiss all of the attacks are being unrealistic, being like, oh, this is never going to happen, my data is very unique, I'm never going to let go of it, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, I decide that this is not a risk. And then basically, I think 6 months later, we basically took the attack that existed, and actually we showed that we can replace this fairly strong construct of an auxiliary data set. And actually, the synthetic data set is often good enough that I can just use the synthetic data set. So I don't need this, strong assumption and magical construct of an auxiliary data set. All I need is literally just the auxiliary data that you give me access to. And this is just one example of how research evolves and why it's really necessary to properly red team synthetic data before releasing it and to keep a reasonable safety margin, meaning assume an attacker stronger than what you think is realistic is how you're going to keep the data safe.
So as I'm listening to you, Yves Alexander, I have a sense of déjà vu in the sense that one could argue that what you're saying would have also been relevant for traditional anonymization. And I don't think you'll disagree with me when you say we haven't got traditional anonymization. We haven't done it very well, in the sense that some of your research has shown that even very few attributes would be enough to re-identify. So in the context of synthetic data, do you think we can do better in terms of anonymizing? And why do you think we won't just repeat the mistakes of the past?
This is such a good question. Basically, from my perspective, so history played out that way. We were pseudonymizing data in the 90s, removing direct identifiers, et cetera, and we're like, well, this is anonymous, this is safe. 95, 98, we basically had, despite previous research, I think Latanya Sweeney's example was the very first one in which, okay, like I'm the governor of Massachusetts, this is my health record, I've been re-identified, et cetera. We know this is not sufficient. Key anonymity, which most of you probably know, was invented at that time. And then we've had this range of more advanced defense techniques and indeed attacks, right? Every time new attacks coming out and then new defense techniques being developed, sometimes, honestly, making the trade-offs more difficult between privacy and utility. And then basically the computer scientists came along and were like, this makes no sense, right? We've done this in a sense in crypto, for example, in cryptography. It didn't really work very well, and now in crypto we have this really nice, formal guarantees, and unless you come with a quantum computer or you have 200 years of a data center that you can use, you basically cannot break this. We need to have the same in privacy, and that gave rise to differential privacy. The goal was really to get rid of this attack and defense, and this, I think I did well, and then 6 months later someone breaks it, et cetera, especially when you release data, you can't often get it back, et cetera. Issue is that to do this, differential privacy basically assumes the worst case attacker, right, which is someone who has access to exactly your data set, the data set where Alexandra is, and I have access to all the information I want about Alexandra. The only thing that I don't know is whether she was in the data set, yes or no. And unfortunately, that is really strong and basically means that often we can't really get this in practice, right? Because it destroys too much of the utility of the data. And so that got us back to the attack and defense, right? In which we do try to protect, and then people come up with better attacks. But I think there's two fundamental differences I'm finally getting to your point, between the identification years and now, which is first, we do have formal guarantees, right? We do have differential privacy. We do have a good understanding of how to efficiently protect privacy and add noise, even if at the moment the formal guarantees, we don't really have them. And then the second one is on the attack front, we keep being able to build attack because we don't have the formal guarantees, but the attacks that we have are much more principled, meaning that we are getting closer to cryptography, that the attacks are mostly about, it's not about a bag of tricks in a sense. It's really, we have fairly solid foundations, fairly strong adversaries, right? Like in key anonymity, you assume, basically the guarantee was, I know your date of birth, and I know your gender, and I know your zip code, but I will never know which kind of car you drive, right? That's not really super solid guarantees. Here, the guarantees are much more, okay, I have access to the data set, like your data set, I have this kind of access to the system, et cetera. So there's still the attack defense, but I think we have the assumptions that we make are, much more, much less random or debatable than they were back in the days.
Okay.
So and this is like a very...
And maybe Alexandra may pick up on some of those points later on. But let's step back and widen the lens a little bit. And I think it's fair to say that pets have certainly become a bit of a sexier topic than they were a couple of years ago. And they've certainly been getting some attention from government and policymakers. In the UK, it's been part of the national digital strategy to talk about the data strategy, to talk about adoption of pets, and the Centre of Data Ethics and Innovation has been tasked to look more in the area of pets. And many of you will have seen in President Biden's order on AI, there was encouragement within the US for the agencies in the US to look at the adoption of pets in particular, and requiring the creation of a research coordination network dedicated to research in the area of pets, and the National Science Foundation to identify ongoing work and opportunities for agencies within the US to look at the area of pets. So, Gabe, I'd be really interested to hear from you on a policy level. What are we seeing out there? Obviously, you have familiarity with what's going on in Canada, but your work also takes you across to work with the G7 and other countries as part of a working group of DPAs that are looking at emerging technologies. Also, you've heard us talk about anonymisation. I'd be really interested to get some views from you on, from a policy point of view, you know, where are we with anonymisation at the moment? Many of us who work in the field have been waiting, in Europe anyway, for the update to the 2014 Working Party, Article 29 Working Party, guidance on anonymisation, which is what we have in Europe. But I'd be really keen to hear from you on some of those policy considerations.
Sure, absolutely. So, yeah, so as you mentioned, we've done some work looking across G7 frameworks at different ways that anonymization has been integrated into frameworks for data protection and privacy. So this is applicable mostly in that context, but I think that, you know, without having verified it, I would suspect that you could extrapolate a little bit beyond that as well. But so, yeah, in terms of some of the trends we've seen, I think that there are some interesting parallels, and it maps onto some of the more technical, like the way that the technical field has emerged. But one of the, I think, interesting kind of base level things that you would notice is that increasingly there's a tendency for policy frameworks to address anonymization in a more explicit head-on way. So kind of point number one would be like, 5-10 years ago, I think it was much more common for frameworks to deal with anonymization in a very implicit de facto way, in the sense of like, to the extent that something isn't personal information, without it being written into the legislative framework, you can kind of just assume that if it doesn't hit that definition, then it's been anonymized. But now what you see more and more is policy frameworks incorporating language that specifically addresses anonymization. Okay, so what do you see when you look at frameworks that have that type of thing? There's some variation across it, but then there's also some common elements that you see kind of across them. So in general, you'll have some policy threshold. It's generally not an absolute threshold, in the sense that like somewhere you'll have to say, we consider this information to be anonymized, right? So there's the kind of the technical end of like, there's probabilities and the spectrum and all that of risk, but at a certain point you'll have to kind of say like, we consider from a policy perspective this information to be anonymized and therefore not treated as personal information anymore. So there's always a threshold. It's different a little bit across different jurisdictions. In some places, the threshold is basically the threshold for considering information to be personal information. In other places, there's sort of an explicit new threshold that's introduced through the definition for anonymization. So something like reasonably foreseeable risk in circumstances, but it's almost never no risk at all, right? So there's some amount of like, okay, the information could potentially be re-identifiable in some very extremely unlikely circumstances. So there's always a little bit kind of left on the policy end to the possibility of re-identification. Generally, there's an understanding that the process should be irreversible. Sometimes that's explicit in the way that the definition is written out. Other times it's sort of read into it, but there's usually an expectation that this is a one-way transformation that can't be undone. Some jurisdictions will specify certain processes or like types of process that need to be applied to information in order to consider it being anonymized. So sometimes that happens through regulations that will say certain forms of testing have to be done and that type of thing. Other times there will be sort of like a general thing, like, you know, must conform with generally accepted best practices, that type of thing. So you see that in some frameworks and not others. And kind of universally, the information is then, once it's been anonymized to whatever the threshold is, and in a way that's consistent with whatever conditions there are, sort of universally and by definition, that information is considered to no longer be personal information. So I think that those characteristics are interesting kind of just in and of themselves, just for what they are. But then it's also interesting to think about what is not in those frameworks, right? And so if you look at the totality of what they contain, it tends to be not particularly elaborate, I guess. And that's not necessarily a bad thing insofar as a framework that's general can allow for adaptation in the face of technological advancement, right? So it allows some flexibility over time. But the challenge that creates is that you then have these areas of interpretation, right? So because the law doesn't spell out how anonymization applies from a policy perspective with respect to, you know, particular applications, that means that a lot is left to the interpretation of regulators and organizations that are seeking to use anonymization. And so I think that there are a few different directions that you could sort of go from there in terms of talking about like current trends and what really matters. I can highlight two briefly. So the first one, and I think that this may be familiar to folks who have seen other panels touching on anonymization at this conference, is this kind of tension between the relative approach and the absolute approach. So depending on the framework that you're talking about and the perspective that you take, some folks would argue that anonymization needs to be done in an absolute way, meaning that it has to be, the data must be anonymized for everybody who could kind of conceivably come into contact with it. A different way of looking at it, which others have advanced and which is sort of differently applicable in different legislative frameworks, is a relative approach, where you would argue that, well, what matters from a policy perspective is really the extent to which the information is anonymized for the entity that's using it. But it could be the case that another entity has access to that data and it's not anonymous to them because they have a key that would re-identify it or whatever else. But so from a policy perspective, it's okay that different actors can have a differential ability to re-identify the data, and it could still be treated by some actors as anonymous, even if that's not the case for others. I think for synthetic data, this is maybe especially relevant because some of the use cases that we've come across are things where an organization will want to do something with the data that they might not have the lawful authority to do, and so they're relying on the fact that it's anonymized and therefore outside of the framework for personal data protection. So for example, organization A wants to disclose data to organization B that organization B will conduct some sort of analysis on. There isn't necessarily the lawful authority to do that set of things, maybe because they're using it for a different purpose than they got consent for originally, that type of thing. So the big question is it okay for organization B to use that data as if it were anonymous, even if organization A can re-identify it very straightforwardly? And so this is an area that I think is still kind of unsettled. There's sort of ongoing legal challenges with respect to that in Europe. In Canada, there is arguably some precedent for a relative approach being possible. So depending on the jurisdiction you're in, there's different things that you could point to here and there, but it's not necessarily definitively, I mean, it's certainly not codified in the law. And I think there's still quite a bit of this kind of gray area space around whether or not it's possible. So I have some other issues that I think are also relevant, but I think in the interest of time, maybe I'll pass it back.
A lot in that, Gabe, and so you touched on a really interesting area, which is this concept of relative versus absolute. And Clara, I'm going to get you to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But one of the things that has surprised me to a certain extent is how little regulatory guidance there has been on synthetic data, because it has been around for a while. And when we've approached regulators about this, they're saying we're reviewing it at the moment. It's new, we get it. And I think in some ways there's a reluctance to grapple with it because there has been a reluctance to grapple with anonymization. And very often industry will say, how do we know we've done enough? How do we know we've anonymized enough? And I think that's led to a degree of paralysis where some very well-meaning companies would like to truly anonymize, but they don't know where the thresholds are. And that has also, I think, led to some organizations perhaps undercooking anonymization, where, you know, perhaps it's just been a bit of masking and we're okay, we'll run with it. And I think some of that baggage is probably coming into play in the area of synthetic data, where there perhaps is a reluctance to engage in this space and provide some guidance, which is unfortunate because it could mean there's a chilling effect in that synthetic data isn't embraced and used. And yet at the conference, we just keep hearing about some of the challenges we have around AI and responsible AI and ethical AI, and how do we use data ethically for that purpose. So I do think, you know, that's where more guidance would be, I think, hugely appreciated. And, you know, I'll give credit to the ICO because they have been a regulator that has provided good guidance in the area of pets and synthetic data. And, you know, Clara, I suppose if you have advice and there's organizations who are thinking about using synthetic data, but perhaps they're a little reluctant because they're not sure about the challenge of truly anonymizing, would you be thinking that even if they don't hit that threshold, there still might be other uses for synthetic data, or perhaps they need to consider how they might use synthetic data?
Thanks, Aoife. So the answer to that one is yes, but probably I'd like to start a little bit before that, where you've mentioned the concept of threshold and Gabe was talking about spectrums, and that's kind of confusing because legally speaking, we have a binary, we don't have a threshold, we have it's either anonymous or it's personal data. So I'd like to start just by explaining how, in my mind or in the ICO's view, those two things match together. So if you're familiar with our anonymization guidance, you'll know that our draft guidance, we have this graphic in it, which is the spectrum of identifiability. So it's a kind of colored line that goes from anonymous personal data to anonymous. So personal data is, you know, our host's privacy salon will have a list of everyone who's attending the conference, their names, their surnames, their email addresses, their affiliation. That's personal data. And then as you move along the threshold, you get into something indirectly identifiable. So on your badge, you have I had a QR code that when I arrived, sorry, not QR code, a barcode that they scanned on my email, and that turned into the badge that they generated for me. So when I looked at the QR code in my email, that doesn't tell me that it's me, but Privacy Salon have the matching between those two, so that data is, the barcode is indirectly identifiable. And then we move along even more to things that are likely to be identifiable or unlikely to be identifiable. And that's where anonymization gets really hard, because you're not saying, well, it's my name and surname, that's obvious, or it's aggregated statistics about the entirety of the conference. You're looking at, well, what means are there to re-identify this data? So you could think that Privacy Salon might want to release maybe just the first names of everyone who attended. Is that personal data? Well, maybe if your name is Pierre, maybe it's not personal data because there's 50 Pierres. But if your name is more unusual, you could be the only person in that. What else could you match around maybe LinkedIn posts to figure out who that one person in the data set is? And that's kind of where you have this spectrum concept, but at the end, you have to make a decision. You have to make a decision as the organization, but also we have to make a decision as a regulator. And I think that's back to your point, Aoife, of kind of how do we approach this as a regulator? How much leniency do we give, or how much credit do we give for a good effort? And I would say this also links to what Eve Alexandra was talking about, which was the red teaming point. So when you're in this uncertain bit of, well, I've done quite a bit, but I'm not sure, that's when you need to think really critically about what additional sources of information are out there, which could be used to match to your data set, what additional tools exist. And this is quite a contextual point that I'll get back to in a second. But I suppose there's a basic legal point that applies not just to the UK, but to other European countries, which is that the GDPR says that it's the means reasonably likely to that have to be considered. So the means reasonably likely to re-identify something, which means that already the legislation is not setting it up as something that has to be absolute. You're allowed to have a margin of appreciation where you think, well, I tried really hard, I considered everything, I considered all the means likely, I'm not going to consider the unlikely or very, very specialist examples. I'm just going to consider what's example in my context. So that's for everyone. And I guess there's another point which is more of an ICO point or a UK-specific point, which is the regulatory interpretation of that common text, which is the relative approach. So going back to the barcode example in the CPD email that we received, in the hands of Privacy Salon, that data is clearly personal data. It's indirectly identifiable. But if just the QR codes were given to another organization who didn't have the lookup table to see, well, this QR code is Clara, this one is Aoife, then in their hands, according to our interpretation, the ICO or UK approach, that could be anonymous data. So we take a relative approach to anonymization. Other DPAs in the European Union have different views on this. Some take an absolute approach, which is, well, because it's identifiable to Privacy Salon, it's identifiable to everyone. So, as I think Gabe mentioned, there's a few cases going through the courts at the moment. The current EDPB guidance from 2014 takes a more absolute approach. CJU guidance, CJU cases that are coming through are indicating a maybe more relative approach, but they're under appeal. And of course, as we all know, the EDPB guidance, the updated one, is still to be released. And I know that we have EDPB colleagues here, so ask them, not me. So just to tie it back to synthetic data, why does this matter? So I think two reasons I wanted to explain this whole spectrum concept. One is, synthetic data doesn't have to be anonymous to be useful. So if you're in the early part of the spectrum where it's directly identifiable, indirectly identifiable, or likely to be identifiable, it still has a lot of data protection benefits, so documented benefits that you can show. I guess if you're looking down the accountability route, why did we do this, or why should we spend money to do this? You're minimizing the amount of personal data that you're using. You're also complying with the purpose limitation principle, so by reducing the amount of data in that data set, you're limiting how it can be used. And then, of course, data protection by design, you're kind of minimizing the data, so that also shows that. And then the second point of why is this all relevant is that I think we shouldn't lose sight, at least in this context of CPDP, of the data protection law. So synthetic data is a newish concept that lots of people are excited about, particularly in the context of AI. But I think for us as a regulator or for people working in data protection, it's really to be judged by the standards of anonymization. So it's not the fact that it's synthetic data in itself that makes it anonymous or not.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. Just because it's new doesn't mean the existing laws don't apply to it. And you've touched very nicely on this concept of relative and absolute. And I think those of us, who would interpret the article, the 2014 guidance would have been around guidance on absolute. And the cases that are going through the court to the ECJ, the SRB case with the EDPS and the Scania case, both of those seem to be suggesting perhaps a relative approach. So anonymous, perhaps in the hands of a third party who doesn't have the original data set, never anonymous in the hands of the original controller who has the original data set. So we have to wait and see what the court says in those. I'm curious, the EDPB has had on its work programme for the last number of years the update to the 2014 guidance. So I'm wondering if there's a slight pause on that, given the cases that are coming before the court, but perhaps not. Perhaps we will see updates to that guidance. And, some areas now look a little old in terms of some of the attack scenarios that are mentioned in that guidance. Alexandra, I'm going to turn to you now because I'm conscious that you went first, so you've been listening to all your colleagues here. I'm curious, given that you're on the front line as a vendor in the area of synthetic data, working with your customers, how are you overcoming some of these issues we've been talking about, issues of legal certainty, thresholds? And I'm also wondering, you're also involved in the IEEE in terms of trying to set some standards. And it would seem that this area is an area that's crying out for some standards so that those well-meaning companies who want to synthesize their data, when they say, is this good enough, that there's some sense of guidelines for them in that area. So I'm curious how you're grappling with all this as a vendor.
Sure. So maybe starting out with the IEEE work, I actually started talking about synthetic data with European data protection authorities back in, I think, 2018, 2019. And already there with the conversation, it was, okay, it's an interesting technology, but how should we actually know if it achieves what it's promised to set out to do? It would be helpful to have something like industry guidelines or standards. And this is when I 3 years back started to establish the IEEE group, which by now counts 70 experts from academia with regulatory background, legal, computational privacy, industry players, and also users of synthetic data. And we decided the most relevant issue when we think about synthetic data is actually answering this question of privacy, of is it anonymous, is it not anonymous? We are not yet at the stage where we can say, okay, we can actually work on a standard, but we've spent quite a lot of time on working on a white paper looking into this question of synthetic data privacy, which it's hard to make some estimations in terms of when it will actually be out, but in the next few months this should be published. And the consensus that we had there was also something that Yves emphasized, that it's important regardless which privacy mechanisms you put into your synthetic data generator. And let me be clear, you need to have privacy mechanisms in there. You need to empirically test this, red team it, to get an estimation of the residual risk. Yet this is something that we find for organizations actually using synthetic data to be the most challenging part. Of course, most legal teams are well equipped with instruments like data protection impact assessments. They can look into the technical and organizational measures that come on top and then also come to the decision of, okay, are we just internally going to use this data, or is this something that should be up on our website? What type of mechanisms do we need to put in on the technical and organizational measure side? But the question of figuring out what is the residual privacy risk with synthetic data is a big challenge. And also to the state of the art, that research work that Yves suggested, here again, then interpreting the results and the thresholds, or interpreting the results and then setting this to a threshold in practice is something where more work is needed, both from academia, from regulators. I think these are the two parties that can help here the most, because it's not these parts of, okay, or I was actually surprised when Gabe mentioned that there are some examples he's aware of where one organization has synthetic data in front of them which could be argued to be completely anonymous, versus for the other, it's quite easy to come back. I haven't yet encountered any synthetic data set up in the way I defined it earlier, where it would be easy to just reverse engineer the process and have the clear data or anything comparable in the end. So I'm therefore wondering what type of definition it is. But for the type of synthetic data generated as per the definition that I started out with, assessing if the residual privacy risk is now okay, or if this is something that can't be considered anonymous, is the biggest challenge to adoption from a privacy point of view.
And Eve Alexander, I'm wondering, you mentioned red teaming, but do we have enough experts that exist that can help organizations? Do they have to bring in external people? Can they grow the expertise internally? How do we overcome this? How do we get this moving where organizations go, I think I've done enough, I've done my red teaming, but, how do we, is there going to be a playbook on this? How do we practically get this, moving in terms of industry and organizations that want to safely start deploying synthetic data?
No, I think it surely is a challenge. It was already a challenge back then. I think two things are helping greatly. The first one is that, in particular, to be honest, for synthetic data, is there exist more and more, fairly generically applicable techniques that one can use to test against like a range of attackers the privacy of your synthetic data. So some toolbox exists and can already be used to assess kind of the most straightforward baseline risk. And then there is indeed, right, like a level of interpretation in terms of, what is a realistic attacker, to which extent am I willing to assume that this data is always going to be kept in a lock and it will not be hacked, it will not end up in a data lake, et cetera, and what do you think is sufficient. I think the second thing that is helping greatly today too is AI. Basically, increasingly, I think modern attacks and testing actually will be done automatically by AI systems. The idea is being that there are, in a sense, too many decisions and details made during the anonymization process or the development of synthetic data that it's becoming very, very difficult for a person, even with significant amount of time on their hand, to properly evaluate and figure out that the combination of this and this and this is what might lead to a vulnerability and that this needs to be fixed. And I think increasingly what we're doing and what I think a lot of people are doing is basically pretty much the equivalent of AlphaGo. Right? It's basically we have AIs that are very, very good at playing chess. They've been very, very good at playing Go. They are becoming very, very good at basically playing a game against your system, against your synthetic data, which is basically I'm going to look at the way your system behaves when I do a certain number of things. I will anticipate my moves, and basically under certain circumstances, I win the game. Right? And if I manage to extract some information about Alexandra from the synthetic data with a certain level of certainty, in a consistent manner, it means there is an issue, I'm winning the game. So I think one, we have toolbox for the baseline risk that are pretty much readily available. And second, I think AI is going to really make the testing much more scalable and much more thorough.
Sarah, you wanted to get in, and then Alexandra, yeah.
Well, I was just going to add to not forget your regulator when you're thinking about red teaming. So you laugh, but I have a valid point to make here. A lot of regulators, ourselves included, say, oh, it's very contextual, and you guys all go, oh, no, don't say it depends, which is why, as well as our guidance and our enforcement actions, we also have more sort of assistive functions. So we have our regulatory sandbox. We also have something called innovation advice, where because these questions are so contextual, you can come with your specific context, and you say, well, we think we've done all these things to make it anonymous. What do you think? And then depending, the regulatory sandbox, for example, is usually 6 months to a year. The innovation advice is a little bit more light touch, but then we work through it from a legal perspective, from a technical perspective, and then we publish all those outcomes in sandbox reports. So although we can't cover all contexts, the more people we have to come to our sandbox with these difficult questions of, is this anonymous, the more we can, in our sort of regulatory approach, kind of red team it with you.
Great.
I actually wanted to dig deeper on what Yves just said. So definitely agree with what he mentioned, and also that AI is super helpful in figuring out new problems that may arise from a privacy point of view. Still, the question of the threshold or how to interpret the results, I think, is one of the big challenges that needs to be tackled. We actually have two sides in debating how this should go forward, because I think it's easy if you use these type of methods and attacks and have a scenario like the Grindr situation where initially nobody would have assumed that a priest would have been encountered on a homosexual dating app, but then it was super, super clear that this was the person, that this priest was on the Grindr data set. So there it's apparent to everybody, you don't need to be a privacy expert, that this is a privacy violation. But what if I use a state-of-the-art approach to assess the privacy of my synthetic data set, and I go from a baseline, probability of I'm wearing a blue shirt from 50% to 55%? Is that an issue? Is 57% an issue? Is 53% an issue? Is 75% an issue? And interpreting this and mapping this in your practical context is a huge challenge for organizations, particularly because they don't have the experience in-house. And I'm curious, both from academia but also from regulatory point of view, with the two different sides that are currently debated, what would be your thoughts? So one is, okay, this is a problem that we need to tackle. Maybe we will find some ways to make it easier for individuals to interpret the threshold, but it always needs to be done on a case-by-case basis. Others say, well, this is such a tricky, complex problem. Each data set is unique. It will be very hard, if not impossible, to come to the perfect threshold for each individual data set, particularly if you don't have the expertise. What if you would build up an ecosystem of, let's say, synthetic data generator auditors who would take, let's say, 20 benchmark data sets, which hopefully establish or have characteristics that you would find in sectors where synthetic data is used, and then this synthetic data generators would be benchmarked and scrutinized against these data sets to see, can I get anything out in terms of privacy? It's never a guarantee that there will not be an issue with the data set that you then synthesize, but could this already be a level of certainty similar to how we, for example, test car safety, where we say, okay, first there's the crash test, only if the dummy doesn't die, then the model is released on the market. If I have bought my car, I'm still responsible to bring it back to the service provider once per year to make some tests to increase the likelihood of my car not bursting into flames. It's not a guarantee that it will not do that, but it increases the safety level. Is this something that would be helpful in the context of synthetic data, simply because it's such a tricky problem for organizations, considering the benefits that synthetic data can have both to privacy protection and to data use? Or is this something where, from an academic or regulatory point of view, say no, organizations need to build up the competency to solve this super, super tricky problem of interpreting and mapping the thresholds?
Wow, the million-dollar question, really. Please, jump in.
Sure, yeah, I think I can sort of start it out there. I think that, I mean, on the regulator end, you always sort of need to reserve the ability to look at something in further detail and say, we don't think that this is compliant, and we think that you need to change your practices. And so in that sense, I think that the sort of second model that you propose, where there's some set, whatever it ends up being, but some set of kind of, generally agreed to, whether it's practices or a model, I think that can be a very useful starting point. And I also think that these don't necessarily need to always be thought of in completely black and white terms, right? So like regulatory compliance is also not just always a matter of, the practices are offside, here's a 10 million euro fine, right? So it can also be the case that things like, there are frameworks out there where regulators are explicitly required to take into consideration things like due diligence in the practices that you've employed. And so I think that I think in the end, you sort of have to take a combination of different approaches and say, okay, has the organization done everything that could reasonably be expected of them? And then on top of that, that includes looking towards models that are already out there for testing, being extremely diligent. I think that it also will always include having some measure of capacity on the part of the organization. I don't think that you can fully escape that. Like, you can't externalize that and say, I'm not going to develop whether it's internal to the organization or sort of a third party they bring on to help them make assessments. But I don't know that you can sort of like abdicate your responsibility for like really understanding what you're doing just by pointing to a model that exists out there somewhere and saying like this is sufficient. So I think that in the end, like a prudent organization would really need to kind of triangulate and adopt a variety of approaches. I don't think that it necessarily needs to be completely one or the other. I think that you can take a variety of these things into consideration, but bottom line from the regulatory end would be like the context is always going to matter.
I'm curious, as I mentioned earlier on, governments have come forward to evangelize adoption of pets, and I mentioned, the UK, I've mentioned the US, and I think what we're all looking for, to Alexandra's point there, are, case studies where, the case study is written up, this is what happened, this is the exercise we went through, this is the threshold, and it was deemed to be good enough to use. And in some ways, it strikes me that the public sector could lead in this space as well. And if the public sector were to adopt pets, so the Data Governance Act specifically talks about adoption of pets in order for data to be released by the public sector. So there is an opportunity also for the public sector to lead in this space and to write up use cases about how pets were used and how that allowed release of data sets. The difficulty I see is, of course, expertise, because this requires a certain expertise that is pretty rare on the market. And so they're going to have to go through an exercise of trying to build up that expertise or bring in third parties to assist them initially anyway. But I think there is a need for case studies. Show us what good looks like. Show us what passed regulatory muster on this. And I think that would really help us all. Any more comments? And then we're going to take a few questions. Yeah.
Maybe very, very quickly, it is difficult, right? Actually, I think more than the spectrum, I think it's about adversaries, attackers, right? It's much more about what would someone need to be able to, extract some information from your data set. And that is kind of what's going to, define, in a sense, more than specific numbers, what the spectrum looks like, in a sense. And I was smiling when Clara said this, just because we've long advocated for companies to actually be a lot more transparent with customer, with the regulator in terms of anonymization practices, right? It's trying to, through this transparency, help build, a know-how of this is where the industry standard is. This is what we've tried. This is what, we think is under those circumstances a reasonable adversary. This is what under those circumstances is a reasonable adversary. A little bit like security, right? If you're a bank, the standards that apply to you when it comes to security are higher than, a newspaper website, are higher than, someone's personal blog, et cetera, et cetera. And there's really a need for a lot more transparency in terms of, we've tried this range of attacker, this is what it looks like. For a certain number of reasons, we're like, okay, this is the one we're concerned about, specifically, et cetera, et cetera. And so a lot more transparency with, with peer institutions, customer, and the regulator in terms of, this is how we've thought about this, this issue. And I think this would greatly help everyone advance in terms of, setting up the threshold. But I think, and again, I'm speaking as myself as a researcher, it requires more transparency. It requires more organization being willing to talk about, okay, this is the trade-offs, this is how we've made the trade-off, rather than turning to the regulator and be like, so this is my threshold, what do you think? Are you more like a 0.8 person or are you a 0.75 person?
I suppose that's an area where the sandboxes allow that dialogue to happen, and they're sort of a safe space, so to speak, for an organisation to go and work with the regulator. And it's interesting, of course, in the AI Act, we see the concept of red teaming in there, and we see the concept of sandboxes in there. So all the conversations we've been having for years, have appeared now as a way of risk mitigation in the AI Act. So I'm going to open it up to the floor and see if we've any questions. I don't know if we have a mic or if you just... we have a mic. So any questions? We have a few, so we'll just take some of the questions.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. It was quite interesting. You're asking about pet technologies for governments and practical uses. The Dutch government, Ministry of Justice, has built Match 3 pet technology. They received a privacy award from one of the privacy organizations. They use it in FIUNet. They tried to build it into PIUNet, but the Germans were not joining us, so that wasn't possible. So there you have one example of using pet technology within European governments for the FIUNet. So maybe you can use that one. And I have been asking all the time, why don't they use synthetic data to test new software within law enforcement? And then they keep telling me, no, that's not possible because we don't know how people interact, criminals with other criminals or unknowns. You can't find them in synthetic data. Would that be possible? Maybe not now, but in the near future?
I'm going to look at you, Alexandra, for that one.
I'm not sure if I have enough context to answer this question. Maybe you come catch me afterwards and I get more context.
It's great to hear that the Dutch are using pets. Is it something that you will publish as a case study or a use case? It is published.
It's published and FIUNet has all the data, and otherwise I can get you contact.
Fantastic. Well, we applaud you for that. We need to see more of that, because for us, we can learn from that, because, presumably if it's good enough at a threshold for government, it's something that we can look to adopt as well. I think there was another question there at the back. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Maybe a bit off topic, but first, thank you very much for the panel. It was very interesting. You touched upon the relative nature of personal data. You talked about some authorities obviously having an absolutist absolutist vision and other a more relative, and touching upon the European Court of Justice rulings, especially the recent ones. Do you understand what the European Court of Justice says in the Scania case, saying that personal data can be personal for an entity, but can indirectly be personal for the first entity, even if it's not personal for it, because I'm still...
I think this area has been difficult for us to really extrapolate from each case learnings. So we've had the Breyer case, and even that case seemed to turn on the facts of that particular case. And then, so what I've understood from the Scania case was it was to do with a chassis number on a car, and whether a chassis number on a car is personal data. And what I understood the court to say was it's not per se personal data, because when it rolls off the assembly line, it's just a chassis number. It's just the vehicle identification number. However, that same information could become personal data when it's associated with an individual. So it's in relation to an individual. And in that case, if there was other information where suddenly that chassis number was associated with other information that then meant it was relative to an individual, it could become personal data. So that's what I understood. But in terms of the relative, again, it could be that, you know, where we've seen the debate is the interpretation of the Article 29 Working Party opinion, and many of the DPAs have said, for it to be anonymous, it must be anonymous to everybody, everybody. You couldn't have it anonymous, just not anonymous to the original controller who holds the original data set, and then not anonymous, so non-personal data in the hands of, say, the data processor or a third party or a vendor. They don't accept that. The absolute is that it's anonymous to everyone, and this idea of irreversibility. Whereas the relative approach is more subjective. You look at, and this was in the case of the SRB, and the General Court was looking at the case of, well, if you look at the context and subjectivity of who is holding the data, is it anonymous to them at the time they're holding the data? And so it seems to be revolving around that question.
Yeah, just to add, this is very, and you touched upon that as well, it's very difficult, and I'm an in-house at a business, it's very difficult to ask businesses to invest in these pets and these technologies, because we do feel that in terms of interpretation, the needle is constantly moving. You see the additional safeguards, for instance, guidelines from the DPB that says if you use pseudonymization, basically there should be no possibility to combine any data in the world to re-identify the person. And on the Scania, it does say that, yes, it is personal data if you have the possibility to re-identify because it has been assigned, the vehicle has been assigned to an individual, but then it is indirectly personal data even for the manufacturer. And there, honestly, nobody seems to understand what that means. Is it or is it not personal data? And what is indirectly personal data mean? Because I understand having indirect information to re-identify the person, but having something that is indirectly personal data doesn't mean that the manufacturer needs to implement GDPR from the beginning just because at some point the data will be re-identified with the individual. Then it does seem that the more we advance, the more the scope of being able to rely on the relative nature or being able to rely on anonymous data, etc., is getting smaller and smaller, just because at some point an authority, the DPB or the European Court of Justice, will say, well, actually, this would allow you to bypass the whole GDPR, obligations, which I understand because the impact would be huge. But then you have companies that invested maybe millions of euros to develop some technologies, just that the needle is moving at some point, just to share some insight from companies as well.
Thank you. Another question at the frontier? Sorry, here.
Hi, Pierre-Yves Lastic. I'm with the European Federation of Data Protection Officers, but I was Chief Privacy Officer of Sanofi, and I've been spending 25 years of my career in clinical research, and we worked with pseudonymized data in clinical research. However, when you want to reuse this data for exploratory purposes, more and more you have to anonymize it furthermore. Or there are companies like the one of Khaled El-Imam that you probably know from Ontario, who is proposing synthetic data, but I'm really not sure that you can make sound medical decision made on data where you're only extrapolating part of the property of your data set. So that's why I don't know. Do you have an opinion of the really applicability of synthetic data for health purposes?
Yep. Volunteer. Go.
I think that's a very good question. So next to answering this privacy question, how can I know if my synthetic data is sufficiently privacy protecting anonymous? Of course, the question of accuracy of this data, utility, fidelity of this data is another one that needs to be tackled. If it's a super high stakes scenario, which could be the case in medicine, then we might not yet dare to say, okay, we can really use this data without any checking back of the original data. What could be interesting in a medical context, though, is saying, hey, what type of data is available and who has access to this data. We also know that in a research community, there's often quite some privilege in which researchers even get access to data sources and which questions they are financed or individually incentivized to answer. If we have synthetic medical data available that can be opened up to a broader group, this allows exploratory work with this data, which then could be taken back to the original data source to make sure if what you've uncovered is something that's worthwhile. So I think this data democratization aspect that's theoretically possible with synthetic data is a super relevant one, simply because data is such a restricted resource nowadays, and it would help us to better use data resources for initiatives that are maybe not in focus currently.
Eve, Alexander, do you want to get in on that one as well?
Yeah, no, I mean, we're on the same page. Basically, I'd be very worried as a scientist, like, I am actually very worried to see some medical papers being published on synthetic data with someone who did not understand that this is synthetic data. I think, like, again, it can be exactly as Alexandra said, right? It can be very useful for developing machine learning models. It can be very useful to understand what's in the data set, to broadly share, to test systems. Again, like, you have no way to know the extent to which the pattern that you're going to see in the synthetic data is going to be true in the original data, because by definition, right, there's an infinity of patterns and not all of them can be preserved. And, especially in medical research, right, you're going to look at some edge cases. The extent to which the edge cases are preserved is debatable. So I think we should be looking very carefully at the privacy of synthetic data, but also be, like, really, really sure that people understand, because it looks and it feels like the original data. That's exactly what it's designed for, but it's fake data, right? It is not the truth, and we need to be extremely clear about this.
Depending on the use case, I would say. So
Yeah. I mean,
medicine, definitely high stakes scenario, but to share an example from one of our longest standing customers, financial services provider, they used synthetic data for digital product development simply because they didn't get access to production data to develop their digital banking app, and because the anonymized to dummy data that they had was useless. It was like 10,000 people, €1 transaction per day. That's not how real customers act and behave. Once this product development team got access to a synthetic replica of their customer base, they could look into, okay, what's the full spectrum of diversity that we have here? And at the beginning, this was back in 2017, they even encountered a small percentage, a microsegment of customers that looked particularly odd. They had 5 different income streams, spent their money in a strange way, and they were like, hey, that must be a bug in your software. Which real sane person would do that? And we looked at everything. It was at the beginning of our company. Everything looked fine. So they took this effort to go back to the original data source and figured out, indeed, there are customers that have a behavior that we never, ever would have expected. So I think synthetic data in a lower stakes scenario where it's not life and death, medicine, etc., but maybe product development within an organization can also be a super valuable resource to increase diversity and inclusion, and also to help organizations to not only work based on their assumption who they believe their average Jane and John Doe customer must be, but actually get a glimpse at what is the spectrum of diversity and how can we come up with services that are inclusive and valuable to them as well. So I think the stakes are the relevant aspect here.
I wanted just to precise, there was There was a workshop organized by the European Medicines Agency at the end of 2017 in London at the time, and we had discussion about the fact that the European Medicines Agency, like all European institutions, has an obligation of transparency on what data, on which databases a drug product has been approved to go to the market. And so the idea was, can we release patient-level data to the public or to independent researcher? And actually the end result was that it was not possible to, because if you anonymize the data, you don't have the utility, you cannot prove anything. That was also the start of looking onto synthetic data, but I don't see any possibility to use it for regulatory purposes, at least.
Okay. I think we may have to wrap it up there. I think there was one other gentleman. Could you, will we just, is it a quick question?
Well, very briefly,
okay.
Related to the thread that was going on. So I would be concerned not only about the privacy characteristics and benchmarking the privacy characteristics of synthetic data, but to the point that you were discussing, the concern that it may be exacerbating biases that exist already in the data on which it was based for particularly medical applications, which touches again on the point of where synthetic data is unsuitable is indeed like the risk assessment of the unknown unknowns, right? So what will you now not be able to discover in your medical application as a consequence of having used synthetic data for that? And I'm wondering if there's any preliminary guidance on how you benchmark or how you assess that risk.
I'm not able to give a benchmark on how this risk is assessed, but I think it's a very valid point from two different angles. First is, of course, you need to look into, is there any potential bias exacerbated throughout the process? One other thing that we've uncovered also with organizations is, again, this data democratization aspect. Oftentimes, the data owners within an organization are not the experts on biases within a data set. So what we've seen is once they opened up this synthetic data set internally because of the privacy protection level that was reached, that more people within the organization could take a look and then also say, hey, wait a moment, it seems like we're not representative here and there, or it looks super odd if we look at this spectrum of customers. Is there something wrong in our data protection collection process? So I don't want to say that this is not a problem. It's definitely, next to privacy utility, something that you need to look into. But again, synthetic data can also help because it allows to get more diverse people looking at the data, and this in general is a good prerequisite to being better equipped to identify certain problems.
I'm going to leave the last comment to you, Eva Alexander.
Sounds good. I'll just follow up. I think basically to me, it is extremely useful, right? It is super valuable. I think to me, from a utility perspective, it works particularly well once you keep in mind that this is data generated by a model and that you have some kind of feedback loop, some kind of way going back to the original data set. And yes, you might use, maybe even in medicine, synthetic data to generate hypotheses, but you need to be able to go back to the original data and actually validate them on the original data. So it works really well in combination with theories, query-based systems, and other mechanisms that allow you to get back to the original data and test very specific hypotheses.
We had this discussion earlier many times before, so you know that I slightly disagree with that high-stakes scenario. Absolutely go back to the real data. But if we think of all the ways data is used in organizations today, and when it's lower-stakes scenarios, do we really always want every team to go back and be actually engaged with privacy-sensitive customer data? Or is there at one point in time also a level of industry where we say, okay, we have mechanisms to assess the data quality, we trust the output of the synthetic data? Today, most organizations, when they start out with synthetic data, use it for machine learning, train machine learning on the original data, train it on the synthetic data, and look if they get comparative performance. Of course, not always a guarantee that things will be well, but if the stakes scenario is lower, then I think also from a privacy point of view, this is a preferable approach, because you don't want to have every team always going back to the production data, if they would even get access to it. But we know that we disagree here.
I think I promised you all an interesting discussion, and when you've got differing opinions on the panel, you know you've had a good discussion. So thank you very much to the panel, and thank you.